Good day, everyone. I am Rebecca Joyce Sibayan from BSED 3A. Now, I will present to you my activity in module number 4.5 in the subject EL 111 Children and Adolescent Literature. Okay, so here is the first question. From the five functions of poetry mentioned, which among the functions seems to be the most informative and would likely affect how you teach poetry in the future? Cite a future scenario. Okay, so here is my answer. From the five functions of poetry mentioned, the function that seems to be the most informative and would likely affect how I am going to teach poetry in the future is the fourth one, which is encourage creative thinking. Okay, so we all know that poetry allows or encourages a person to think creatively, or when a person creates or reads a poem, the imagination and creativity of that person will eventually work. Okay, so the future scenario is that sooner or later or in the future, I will teach poetry to my students. And when I already taught them the definition of poetry, the examples, analyzation, and application will follow. So it means I will let their own poem, and of course, their creative thinking will be used the most, especially in expressing their thoughts or feelings, or in imagining things while they are creating their own or original poem. Now, let's move on to the second question. From your personal observation, are there any differences and or changes with how children's poetry and poetry in general are structured and presented before and nowadays? Describe these differences and changes. So my answer is, based on my own observation, there are lots of changes with how poetry and poetry in general are structured and presented before and nowadays. The first one is, before, children's poetry and poetry in general was mostly presented through oral form, and now it can be presented through oral and written forms. Okay, so basically, before, our ancestors used to transmit or present our literature, specifically poetry, through lullabies or nursery rhymes in oral form. Okay, so now, since our literature has already been developed, we can or we can already present and transmit our literature, such as our poetry, through oral and written form. Okay, so the second one is, before, children's poetry and poetry in general was very simple when it comes to its structures, and now there are already many structures. So before, there are no many structures that our ancestors or our writers or authors should consider in writing poems. But now, in writing and reading poems, we have many structures to consider and to follow, such as the speaker or the person who is telling or who is speaking the poem, and the stanza, the lines, the rhyme scheme, each the rhythm, and of course the theme. Now, let's proceed to the question number 3. Explain this line from a poet and writer, Jeanette Winterson, that poetry, it isn't a hiding place, it is a finding place. So here is my answer. According to Jeanette Winterson, poetry is not a hiding place, but it is more on a finding place. In poetry, we can find our true feelings or emotions, and through poetry, we can express it genuinely. we can't hide the fact that poetry is everywhere. We can find it anywhere. In poetry, we don't have to hide our true identity or personality, and we don't have to pretend to be someone that we are not. Because in poetry, we can find who we really are and we can be who we are. And it includes our true feelings and thoughts. And in poetry, we are we. We are who we really are, and we can hide anything in poetry because even the words that we will be or we are going to use will reveal our true personality and our true identity. So the second one is poetry can bring out something special within us that we never expected that we have it. It can be a skill or interest. It makes us realize that we have these things within ourselves. Okay, so basically, poetry will help us realize the things that we have that we never expected that we have those things or those skills, such as when we engage ourselves in poetry, reading or in writing a poetry, we can realize or we can see things within us that we are skilled or we are suited or we are fit in poetry, especially in writing or in reading. And we can realize or we can see that we love these things or we are interested in poetry or in reading poetry or in creating a poem. Okay, so now, the last but not the least, we have the number 4 question. There are suggested steps to follow in teaching poetry to younger audiences. Why do you think it has that arrangement or flow? Explain your answer. So here is my answer. It is simply because in teaching poetry to kids, we must make sure that they remember and understand the poem, and they learn, relate, and connect their own experiences to the poem. Okay, so to explain further, the suggested steps are arranged like that for the children to easily remember or memorize the poem, for them to clearly understand what the poem is all about, and to relate themselves with the poem that they have read. So those steps are made for the children to engage themselves in poetry. So that's all. Thank you and God bless.